I'm Danielle, 27, an urban planner in Seattle. The espresso machine was sputtering. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Big mistake. The voice on the other end was clipped and professional. "This is Catherine Bennett, your grandmother's attorney. 6 months had passed since Eleanor Jackson's funeral, a funeral my parents told me I was not allowed to attend. Now, her lawyer was calling me? My parents had been very clear, you weren't in the will. That lawyer's call immediately shattered their narrative. My coffee went immediately cold. My world suddenly tilted. Then Catherine dropped the urgent demand, "We need to meet today." Why the sudden urgency? What colossal secret were they desperate to bury? I'm Danielle, 27, and my life is defined by the grind. I'm an urban planner at a demanding firm in downtown Seattle, perpetually fueled by bad coffee and sheer, unwavering will. That intense focus was always necessary because my home life offered zero comfort or genuine support. My parents, Robert and Sarah Jackson, built an immaculate public image of a picture-perfect, wealthy family. It was all designer clothes, country club memberships, and mandatory annual charity galas. They spent their entire lives managing that beautiful, expensive, and elaborate facade. And where did I fit into their masterpiece? I was constantly framed as the single, persistent burden, the unmanageable variable that continually threatened their perfect, curated story. My existence was simply an inconvenience, something to be politely, if cruelly, ignored. While I was consistently framed as the burden, my brother Mark and sister Lily were the family's prized possessions. Mark lived the textbook easy life, big, flashy purchases immediately funded by Dad, and a revolving door of poorly conceived entrepreneurial ventures that never quite landed but were constantly praised for their vision. Lily, meanwhile, enjoyed dabbling in an expensive new hobby every 6 months, exclusive yoga retreats in Bali, high-end ceramics classes requiring imported clay, or consulting on boutique wine importing. They were perpetually celebrated for their boundless potential and their beautiful, effortless effort. I was simply Danielle, the other. For me, the rules were always drastically different: fewer invitations to elaborate family trips, a much smaller allowance, and relentless, constant scrutiny on my grades and my career path. I was expected to perform perfectly, yet remain largely invisible. I was the permanent, silent guest in my own story, only ever allowed to be there to provide a stark, convenient contrast to their dazzling, effortless lives. I was the required backdrop for their success, a perpetual reminder of the pressure to conform and the deep cruelty of family exclusion. Catherine Bennett's office was polished mahogany and quiet, intimidating confidence. She didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. She cut straight to the bone. "Danielle, there are certain significant irregularities concerning your grandmother's estate that we must discuss immediately." I was instantly skeptical. My parents had spent 6 months drilling into me that Eleanor left nothing but debilitating debt and a mess. "Irregularities?" I pressed, leaning forward. "What kind?" My family swore that my grandmother didn't even know my current address, let alone include me in anything legal. Catherine paused, her professional expression utterly unreadable. "That, Danielle, is precisely the point we need to investigate." This conversation hit me hard because, as an urban planner, I was trained to analyze complex systems, find the cracks in the foundations, and rigorously audit the details. Now, suddenly, I had to audit my own family's deepest, most protected lie. The initial shock quickly dissolved into a laser-like focus, driven by the smallest flicker of early hope. At home, the emotional and financial ledger was always dramatically unbalanced. Mark's latest big purchases, the high-end sports car, the unnecessary luxury boat, were instantly hailed as investing in his brand or demonstrating his vision. Meanwhile, my long hours grinding at the firm, my promotions, and my professional dedication, those were simply dismissed as what you're supposed to do, the baseline requirement for minimal acceptance. Lily's revolving, expensive list of new hobbies were always celebrated as self-discovery and artistic exploration. My rigorous, hard-won professional certifications were simply a necessary evil to keep my job. The constant comparison wasn't subtle, it was a deliberate, sharp tool used to keep me small, perpetually inadequate, and deeply insecure. Anytime I tried to talk about my actual work about creating complex housing solutions for the city, my father would immediately pivot. The conversation would instantly turn into a condescending lecture on Mark's boundless potential or my own perceived financial shortcomings. Since genuine applause wasn't on the menu, I quickly learned to nourish my ambition with discipline. My days became a brutal, unforgiving rotation, early morning buses, cheap thrift store meals, and endless late nights immersed in complex GS maps and zoning code. I was working until 1 a.m., fueled only by willpower and cheap caffeine. Mark and Lily got trust funds and careful parental guidance. I got a cheap, used laptop. I built my professional competence, brick by lonely brick, from concrete analysis and complex coding without one single word of encouragement from my family. Every single long hour, every sleepless night staring at that glowing screen was my silent, desperate contract with the future. I wasn't just proving I could succeed without them, I was proving I could succeed in spite of their calculated neglect and constant, corrosive criticism. My true foundation was forged in that resilience. My professional promotions, which felt like major victories in my independent life, were met at home with an unnerving, deafening silence. I'd enthusiastically share a zoning win that secured crucial funding for affordable housing. They'd immediately change the subject to Lily's ceramics exhibit or Mark's latest questionable financial investment. My achievements simply didn't fit the approved family narrative, so they were conveniently erased. This emotional withholding reached a painful peak when I once asked my father for a small, structured loan, not a gift, to help cover my final, expensive professional certification fees. My father, the same man who readily funded Mark's unnecessary jet ski and Lily's international retreats, looked me dead in the eye and offered a condescending, detailed lecture on responsible financial planning instead of support. That crushing moment solidified the unspoken contract. The emotional ledger between us would never, ever balance. They were determined to keep me perpetually indebted, not financially, but emotionally, by ruthlessly withholding the one thing I truly craved: recognition and simple familial pride. I wasn't just working twice as hard for half the credit, I was working to escape the crushing, devastating reality that my family would never truly see me or acknowledge my value. I eventually resigned myself to that profound solitude, believing it was the price of my independence. Catherine didn't waste much time detailing the ambiguous irregularities of the estate. Instead, she reached into a secure, locked drawer in her polished mahogany desk and slid over a thick, cream-colored, sealed envelope. The weight of the envelope in my hand felt immense, disproportionate to its size. She then stated clearly, her voice cutting through the silence, "This is not legal jargon. This is a personal letter, sealed by the deceased herself, from Eleanor Jackson to Danielle." My breath literally stalled in my chest. A personal letter, from the woman whose funeral I was forbidden from attending. I carefully broke the seal. Inside, Eleanor's familiar, graceful script began with the words, "My Danielle." Just those two words, a name I hadn't heard spoken with genuine, unconditional affection in well over a decade, shattered the massive wall of emotional defense I had so painstakingly built over my adult life. Eleanor went on, praising my quiet grit, my independence, and my hard-won professional success. She wrote that she always saw the truth behind the picture-perfect lives Robert and Sarah were living. She subtly hinted at deep, long-buried family secrets concerning my life and my past. For the first time since childhood, I felt completely seen and validated, recognized not for my professional utility, but for my true, resilient self. This wasn't just a letter, it was an emotional anchor and a declaration of war, instantly giving me the courage to challenge everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. Eleanor's letter wasn't just a kind gesture, it was a profoundly strategic document. She acknowledged my natural grit and the specific unjust burdens she knew I was carrying. Crucially, she praised my urban planning career not because it made a high salary, but because of my genuine, proven commitment to community and accessible planning. She vividly recalled a seemingly forgotten childhood conversation, a tiny, precious moment when I told her I wanted to build beautiful, accessible places where every person felt seen. She wrote, "That dream, Danielle, is where your true inheritance lies, and it's the only thing that cannot be mortgaged or stolen." For the very first time in my entire life, a respected elder in my family saw my intrinsic self-worth. She treated me like a trusted ally, hinting at the difficult, deep truths Robert and Sarah had been diligently working to conceal since her death. This letter wasn't just warmth, it was a personal mandate. It instantly gave me permission to be both vulnerable and strong, shattering the myth that I had to be perpetually hardened. I realized my success wasn't just professional, it was personal and emotional. I was finally feeling genuine happiness, driven by a deep sense of truth, not by the constant, exhausting pressure of my family's expectations. Eleanor's letter gave me a new lease on hope. The legal documents gave me cold, hard, indisputable proof. Catherine slid a thick, imposing binder across the mahogany table. It contained the real, raw numbers, the financial reality Robert and Sarah had desperately, maliciously tried to bury beneath a blanket of lies and manufactured despair. Eleanor's estate was far, far from debt-ridden. It was substantial and liquid. The total liquid assets alone, excluding the primary residence, exceeded a staggering $2.1 million. My parents had repeatedly, confidently claimed she was broke, counting on that manufactured lie to discourage any curiosity from me. They had been lying for 6 long months. And then there was the house. The sprawling, elegant family home where I had spent my lonely, scrutinized childhood was strategically excluded from my parents' personal assets. It was secured separately and legally inside a meticulously drafted testamentary trust for specific, named beneficiaries. I scanned the executor documents, my heart hammering against my ribs, struggling to maintain my professional composure. My parents' names, Robert and Sarah Jackson, were conspicuously and purposefully absent from the main distribution list. The executor of the trust, the sole person with the power to disperse the funds? Catherine Bennett. The primary, overwhelming beneficiary, Danielle Lee. Their entire elaborate narrative, the one that framed me as the unwanted relative, the financial burden, the daughter who owed them everything and deserved nothing, collapsed instantly into a mountain of paper and deceit. They hadn't simply left me out of Eleanor's funeral. They had conspired, actively and criminally, to erase me from her legacy. The truth was undeniable. They had been working to deny me my rightful, substantial inheritance, carefully plotting to absorb it themselves, while cloaking their theft in the false dignity of family unity. The rising fury in my chest wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It wasn't the helpless anger of a child begging to be seen. It was something sharper, more dangerous, the righteous, focused heat of justified betrayal. Catherine, reading the dangerous storm in my eyes, spoke calmly. "We have the original, notarized will, the ironclad trust documents, and multiple independent valuations. We are legally sound. There is no challenge possible." She looked me dead in the eye, shifting from lawyer to co-conspirator. "It's time to set up the execution meeting. It needs to happen in person at the Jackson family residence. It's time we deliver the truth right to their doorstep." Seeing the cold, legal truth contained in those executor documents didn't just inform me, it triggered a terrifying, involuntary mental flashback. The years of microaggressions, the subtle cruelty, the deliberate sidelining, it all clicked into a sharp, excruciating focus. I remembered Lily's elegant wedding, a core family event, where my physical invitation arrived weeks late, listing me bizarrely as a simple +1 to Mark, rather than her sister. My mother, Sarah, claimed it was a hasty clerical error that she couldn't fix in time. The lawyer's documents and the exclusion of my name confirmed it was entirely deliberate, a calculated moment of public humiliation and profound rejection. But the funeral was the most egregious, unforgivable lie. My father, Robert, had tearfully told me over the phone, Eleanor left strict instructions for a private, intimate family service. Danielle, no outsiders. They successfully, deliberately framed me as an outsider to my own bloodline, preventing me from saying goodbye and further cementing my emotional isolation. The sheer volume of evidence and the meticulous planning showed the cruelty wasn't random or accidental. It was carefully engineered. Every slight, every exclusion, every patronizing word was part of a controlled, systematic demolition of my self-esteem, designed precisely to ensure I felt so small, so unentitled, that I would never challenge them on anything. The motive for this elaborate, lifelong manipulation was now terrifyingly clear. They believed Eleanor would leave the substantial estate entirely to them. They needed me to feel so inferior and so perpetually indebted to their kindness that if I ever, by chance, discovered the true will, I would quietly walk away out of a deeply misplaced sense of family loyalty and deference. The emotional weight of that calculated betrayal caused my carefully constructed adult defenses to collapse. I wasn't just wronged by a family with favoritism, I had been systemically lied to, manipulated, and erased since childhood. The fight ahead was suddenly no longer just for money or assets. It was a desperate, essential war for my entire identity and my right to exist outside their toxic lie. I thought the betrayal of the inheritance was complete, the ultimate insult to my years of struggle. I was terribly wrong. Catherine looked at me, her gaze heavy and steady, before placing one final, crucial document on the mahogany desk. This wasn't about money or real estate. It was about identity. She read directly from Eleanor's attached, sworn affidavit, Danielle is not adopted. My entire world, built on the shifting sands of their fabricated history, seized up. Robert and Sarah had spent my entire life casually hinting, and sometimes openly stating, that my perceived difference and failure to integrate was because I was the family's charity case, the outsider they had graciously taken in the poor, ungrateful relative who owed them everything for their magnanimity. The real, devastating truth was simple and cruel. My birth mother was Jennifer. She was Robert's first, long-dead wife and ambitious, dedicated urban planner, just like me, who died in a tragic accident when I was only 2 years old. Sarah, who had been Jennifer's supposed best friend, arrived 6 months later, married Robert, and systematically, deliberately erased her existence from the family archive. My grandmother had been fiercely fighting them on this issue for years, but Robert and Sarah successfully petitioned the court to remove Jennifer's name from my birth certificate and all official records, replacing it with Sarah's own, a legal act of identity theft against both me and my real mother's memory. I was never the outsider. I was the original, direct legacy. My stubborn grit wasn't some self-taught defense mechanism. It was inherited, the inherent determination of a mother who built things and fought passionately for her vision. The reason for their relentless suppression was now terrifyingly clear. I was too much like the strong, ambitious woman they had successfully destroyed and were desperate to forget. My existence was a perpetual threat to Sarah's carefully constructed position. The decision was instantly, irrevocably made. I no longer had to live by their manufactured, suffocating narrative. Eleanor's letter was my permission slip for full, immediate independence, a mandate to reclaim my suppressed history, my stolen identity, and my rightful future. Every cruel word, every patronizing slight they had ever delivered suddenly lost all its power, dissolving into dust. I finally saw their actions for what they truly were: pure, desperate fear. Fear that the truth, Jennifer's vibrant, powerful legacy, would inevitably emerge through me and completely dismantle their perfect facade. I stood up, no longer the quiet, dutiful daughter, I was Jennifer's daughter, Eleanor's heir, and I was about to walk into that opulent mansion not as the forgotten guest seeking validation, but as the uninvited owner carrying the definitive legal and emotional truth. The time for silent resignation was over. The air in the Jackson family drawing room was thick with their assumed smug triumph. Robert, Sarah, Mark, and Lily sat, radiating impatient confidence. I walked in with Catherine Bennett, not as the familiar marginalized daughter, but as a calculated legal force. Robert cleared his throat, radiating his usual brand of fake sympathy. "Danielle, dear, we're so glad you came. Your grandmother, bless her soul, left an absolute mess. We need you to sign these quick disclaimers to simplify the debts and close the estate." He pushed documents across the table without looking me in the eye. I didn't even glance at the papers. I just placed Eleanor's personal, sealed letter directly onto the antique coffee table, the sound echoing in the expensive quiet. "We're not here to sign your disclaimers, Father. We are here to formally execute the true will." Sarah's condescending smile vanished instantly. Mark went visibly pale. Robert's face twisted from patronizing concern to sheer panic. He lunged for the letter, but Catherine smoothly intercepted him, her voice low and authoritative. "I strongly advise against touching any estate property, Mr. Jackson." She didn't bother reading the emotional letter. Instead, she read the dry, legal abstract, emphasizing the betrayal. Due to recent irregularities, attempted concealment, and evidence of deliberate fraud regarding the will, the word fraud hung heavy and corrosive in the opulent room, silencing Lily's rising shriek. Catherine confirmed the substantial $2.1 million in liquid assets was designated solely to Danielle. For a heartbeat, silence. Then it shattered. Lily shrieked, the sound piercing the air like glass breaking. Mark erupted, shouting over her, his words tumbling out in rage, "We'll fight this. We'll get better lawyers, real lawyers, expensive lawyers. This isn't over." But the loudest sound was Sarah's whisper. Her eyes, wide with naked fear, locked on Danielle. "The house," she breathed. I finally broke my silence, my voice low, clear, and completely steady, the voice of an urban planner delivering a final, unavoidable audit. The Jackson family residence is now legally the property of the Eleanor Jackson Testamentary Trust. And as the primary beneficiary, the house now has a new owner, Robert stammered, his body visibly shaking. But you're just the beneficiary." I delivered the final surgical blow, enjoying the moment of pure, cold vengeance. "No, Father. I am merely the beneficiary. The house is legally vested in the trust, managed by Catherine. You, your wife, and your children have precisely 48 hours to vacate the premises." Robert's desperate stammering ceased. He simply stared, the man who controlled millions suddenly rendered utterly powerless by the simple, undeniable truth of the trust. Sarah, on the other hand, erupted, her composure dissolving into a flood of tears fueled by pure, calculated fury at the loss, not grief. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me, her voice shrill. "You always were an ungrateful brat. We gave you a name, a home. You wouldn't be anything without us. You owe us everything." Her familiar, toxic words, once sharp enough to cripple me, were now utterly hollow and impotent against the ironclad legal evidence. I met her spiteful gaze, my own eyes completely clear. "You didn't give me a name, Sarah. You stole it and replaced it with your own to complete your perfect illusion. My name is Danielle Lee, daughter of Jennifer Jackson, a planner, like me." The declaration of my true parentage hung in the air, a devastating blow. Mark and Lily, witnessing the horrifying reality of the identity theft charge, immediately backed away from their parents, instinctively protecting themselves. They suddenly saw me not as the family burden, but as the victim and the new, highly volatile owner. I picked up Eleanor's letter, placing my hand over her familiar script. "You always saw me," I whispered, a quiet tribute to the memory of my grandmother. She didn't just leave me money and assets, she left me the invaluable gift of truth and the power to finally demand unconditional respect. Catherine concluded the meeting with the cold finality of the law. All personal effects and immediate financial access for Mr. and Miss Jackson are now legally frozen pending full investigation into the attempted probat fraud and identity falsification. You will receive formal notification of the proceedings. Robert tried one last desperate, pathetic plea, his voice cracking. Danielle, please, we are family. Think about what you're doing. I took one definitive step back, my answer measured and firm. Family, you actively destroyed my mother's memory and systemically tried to destroy my future. You are just tenants now. I turned and walked out, leaving the scene of their chaos and self-destruction behind. For the very first time, I walked away from the Jacksons not with sadness, but with genuine, unburdened freedom. The grand, oppressive house was finally mine. The keys, heavy and cold, rested in my palm. Yet, standing in the echoing entrance hall, the overwhelming feeling wasn't the rush of triumph I'd anticipated, but a deep, chilling void. The opulent mansion was finally empty of their corrosive toxicity, but the silence was deafening, a hollow monument to years of emotional neglect. I saw the news later, Robert and Sarah, looking desperate and pathetically small, being escorted off the premises by security, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. They drove away in an anonymous car with Mark and Lily, a pathetic, diminished version of their once picture-perfect family. They were irrelevant now, but the hollow space inside me remained. Seeking an anchor, I walked through the house until I found Jennifer's old planning room, a space Sarah had kept rigorously locked and covered in dust sheets for decades. It smelled of neglect and old dreams. Here, tucked away in a dusty cabinet, I found my mother's original sketches and meticulously detailed Seattle zany maps. That was the real inheritance, not the millions, but the shared legacy of purpose. My mother was the original planner. My work, my innate grit, was not an accident or a rebellion, it was a continuation of her passionate, unfinished vision. I cried then not tears of bitterness or loss, but for the child who was never truly seen and the remarkable woman whose memory had been so callously stolen. It was a profound, quiet moment of grief for the life that should have been, for the mother I should have known. But the grief was momentary, quickly dissolving into fierce clarity. The money gave me the power, the truth gave me the definitive blueprint. I wasn't going to live in this museum of lies, a place designed for Sarah's vanity. I was going to use the liquid assets to execute the real Jackson plan, the one focused on building communities, not facades. I immediately called Catherine Bennett. The house needs to be sold, Catherine. Every single luxury asset, liquidated. I want to establish the Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation, focused specifically on sustainable, affordable urban development. That is the only fitting use for this estate. The final, sweet taste of victory wasn't seeing their downfall. It was realizing I finally had the resources, the identity, and the moral clarity to honor my mother's name and build a life of genuine purpose, the kind of life that could never be quantified by a fancy address or a country club membership. I had traded their toxic wealth for authentic peace. My legal victory was decisively solidified. Robert, Sarah, Lily, and Mark were officially evicted, their toxic empire shattered. Yet the house felt colder, heavier. The true quest remained, to find the fragments of the mother I lost. I returned to Jennifer's study, the room Sarah had locked away, and meticulously searched the ancient bookshelf. Behind a familiar volume, I discovered a false back in Eleanor's hidden archive, a decade of her personal journals, marked with dates and sealed letters detailing the years after Jennifer's death. Eleanor's script was small, but her insight was enormous. She detailed everything. She knew Robert had started dating Sarah before Jennifer's tragic accident. The car crash was officially ruled accidental, but Eleanor wrote in chilling detail that she always believed Robert's calculated neglect was a significant factor, an insidious desire to get Jennifer out of the way so he could secure Sarah's easier companionship and, critically, Sarah's family connections. This revelation transformed my horror into a cold, specific rage aimed at Robert. The journals laid bare the core of Sarah's profound hatred for me. Jennifer, my birth mother, was the true heir to the Jackson name, the brilliant, ethically driven urban planner who gave the family its social legitimacy through hard work and genuine accomplishment. Sarah was the insecure, opportunistic social climber and gold digger who tried to replace the irreplaceable woman. My existence, my face, my natural inclination toward planning and grit was a constant damning reminder that Sarah was and always would be the substitute. Eleanor's notes shifted from brutal legal history to tender personal connection. She wrote of a specific ring, Jennifer's simple, engraved wedding band, which Robert had claimed was lost in the wreck. Eleanor had secretly recovered it years ago and had it secured in a bank deposit box for me. A small card with the key was marked, "The only true inheritance, Danielle. It is yours." The money, the house, the shame I had brought upon their name, it was all necessary for justice. But the profoundest pain was confirming that Robert, my own father, had not just neglected me, but had actively and deliberately aided in the erasure of my entire history and the destruction of my mother's memory for the sake of his convenience and Sarah's vanity. I finally accepted a cold, hard truth. There would be no emotional payoff, no cathartic grand apology, no reconciliation. My victory was utterly solitary. They were gone, their toxic empire destroyed, their financial and social standing reduced to rubble. But the void left by their lifelong cruelty was a deep, jagged scar that would take years of deliberate self-care to heal. I stood alone in the silence, acknowledging the pain. Eleanor's final instructions were a blessing, lifting the silence. She stated the trust's real, non-negotiable purpose, to immediately fund the foundation, ensuring that Jennifer's vision of equitable city planning and affordable housing would finally be realized through my hands, using the fortune they had tried to steal. I took the small brass key to the deposit box. I didn't need the millions to feel worthy, but the ring, my mother's ring, held captive for decades, that was the sacred symbol of my true belonging and the legacy I now carried. I was no longer Danielle Lee, the ungrateful, rejected daughter, but Danielle Lee, the legitimate heir, the true steward of the Jackson name, and the architect of Jennifer's unfinished dream. My act of revenge was complete, and my life of purpose was just beginning. The dust hadn't even settled on the eviction when the recovery attempts began in earnest. The Jacksons weren't the type to accept a defeat quietly. They were accustomed to manipulating reality. News outlets were immediately running sympathetic stories about Robert's unjust ousting from his ancestral home, painting him as the tragic victim of a bureaucratic legal error, a subtle attempt to sway public opinion and create pressure. First came the expected, hollow legal threats, which Catherine Bennett immediately dismissed as noise. Then came the desperate emotional appeals. Robert, my father, tried to call me 14 times in one afternoon, leaving progressively more frantic and self-pitying voicemails. Sarah, ever the master manipulator, sent a long, rambling, sickeningly sweet text about forgiveness, moving forward, and the unbreakable bond of family blood. Lily, predictably, tried the most direct, emotional tactic. She messaged me, "I miss you, sis. Mark's business is totally ruined. We literally have nowhere to go. Please, let's just save the family together. We can fix this." She wanted me to dissolve the trust, granting them access to the assets. I watched the incoming messages, the desperate attempts to rebuild the emotional cage they had kept me in for decades. But the magic, the poisonous influence was finally gone. My defense wasn't blinding rage, it was an absolute, liberating detachment. They were simply characters from a pathetic, poorly written book one had finally finished reading. I sent one single, calculated response, carefully copied to all four of them, and signed professionally by Catherine. All future communication regarding the estate of Eleanor Jackson, the Jackson residence, or Danielle Lee must be directed exclusively to Trust Counsel. No exceptions. Danielle Lee is unavailable for personal contact. The door was permanently, irrevocably closed. Weeks later, my life felt defined by creation, not confrontation. My new office was humming with purpose. The Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation was formally incorporated, and I was wholly focused on drafting zoning proposals and making my mother's dream of equitable city planning a reality. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. I felt like I was finally building something that mattered, something that couldn't be stolen or tarnished. But the past, like a persistent shadow, had one last, ugly hook left in me. Catherine walked in, her face uncharacteristically grave, a thick new folder in her hand. Robert and Sarah's remaining assets are firmly frozen, pending the felony fraud investigation. They can't touch a dime. But we have a new problem concerning Mark and Lily. Their own finances are collapsing, and they're looking to destabilize you. Their debt, Catherine explained, wasn't inherited, it was entirely self-inflicted. Mark's failed, ill-conceived luxury car business was a financial sinkhole. They were facing immediate foreclosure on their own house, and Lily, in an act of pure desperation and spite, was threatening to sue the trust for ludicrous claims of emotional distress caused by the eviction of her parents, a suit she hoped would force a quick, quiet settlement. My initial, visceral reaction was cold and unyielding. Good. They had stood by silently, complicit in Robert and Sarah's emotional abuse of me for 2 decades. They had benefited from the lie. They deserved every bit of their financial ruin. I looked Catherine dead in the eye and delivered my first, hard instruction: let them face the natural consequences of their choices. Their complicity has a price. Catherine, ever the pragmatic advisor, cautioned me. The suit is legally frivolous, and we will win easily. But it's designed to be a media spectacle, a drawn-out family soap opera in the press. They want you to make an emotional mistake. We need to detach your name, and the foundation's name, from this mess completely, immediately, and surgically. Her professionalism hit the mark. I leaned back, looking at a faded, tiny photo on my desk, a relic of a child, me and Lily, briefly sharing a genuine smile in Eleanor's garden. Despite the lifetime of calculated slights, a small, stubborn voice of conscience whispered, did they deserve to be homeless? My revenge against Robert and Sarah, the architects of the abuse, was absolutely justified and complete. But was my ultimate goal merely to inflict maximum suffering on their children, or was it to embody the higher principle of justice and equitable treatment that my mother's legacy demanded? I chose the latter. My final act of revenge wouldn't be cruel, it would be strategic, precise, and purposeful. I told Catherine my final decision, a move that would simultaneously neutralize the legal threat and further my mother's mission. Contact their attorney. The trust will settle the frivolous suit immediately, but the compensation will be purely symbolic, $1. I continued, outlining the surgical strike. However, the trust will secretly buy Mark and Lily's home directly from the bank during the foreclosure process, paying the full asking price to satisfy the debt. We will then immediately and publicly donate the property to the Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation. Catherine's eyes widened. You're going to convert their family home into a unit for affordable housing? I gave her a small, satisfied nod. It fulfills Jennifer's original vision perfectly. It also ensures that Mark and Lily receive nothing, except for the cold, hard knowledge that the house they built their superficial life in now permanently benefits the community they ignored. They get no money, no property, and no emotional satisfaction. It's the ultimate clean break. This is the final transaction, I told Catherine, standing up. No more Jacksons. No more legacy of abuse. Just the foundation and the future. The crisis is over. Weeks passed quickly. The Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation was thriving, becoming a recognized force in equitable city planning. I finally retrieved my mother's ring from the deposit box, a simple, elegant platinum band, lightly engraved. I wore it not as a promise of marriage or wealth, but as a talisman of truth, a physical link to my true lineage and the resilience of the women in my family. Robert, my father, made one last, desperate, pathetic attempt at contact. He showed up at the lobby of my office building, looking utterly defeated, his tailored suit rumpled and his eyes vacant. He didn't ask for money or the house back. he asked, simply, a question born of his complete inability to self-reflect. Why, Danielle? Why did you do this to us? We're family. I didn't see him. I didn't need to. I had already achieved the harsh realization that provided the answer. They never saw me as a person deserving of love or even basic respect. I was always just an object to them, a frustrating hurdle to Eleanor's money, a convenient stand-in daughter for Sarah's social facades. The cost of their betrayal was their empire. The cost of my victory was the final, irreversible death of the family fantasy I had clung to for so long. The realization hit me with the force of a cold wave. True revenge doesn't taste sweet like fiction. It tastes clean and surgical. I had used their own revered rules, the letter of the law, cold financial strategy, and unyielding logic to precisely dismantle their illusion. The Jackson residence was sold at a premium. The entire profits, secured by the trust, fully endowed the foundation. The beautiful, quiet irony, the house built on lies and emotional exclusion was now permanently funding equity and community inclusion, finally fulfilling Jennifer's true, forgotten vision for the city. I had secured my inheritance, reclaimed my rightful name, and, most importantly, honored my mother's memory through action. I was Danielle Lee, the successful planner, the legitimate heir, the founder. My story was no longer about a toxic family revenge plot. It was about building a new, authentic life on the solid foundation of truth and purpose. The fight was over, and the future was truly mine. The foundation's public launch was a crucial, but deeply nerve-wracking, final step. I stood before the assembled press, ready to finally pivot from victim to visionary. Catherine was there, standing beside me, an unshakable pillar of legal confidence. Today, I announced, my voice steady, we launched the Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation, dedicated to creating sustainable, affordable urban spaces, a continuation of my late mother's unfulfilled, passionate work. I used Jennifer's name deliberately, publicly correcting decades of erasure. Predictably, the questions immediately shifted from philanthropy to pure tabloid scandal. A reporter aggressively shouted, "Danielle, what about your father's claims of unjust eviction? And is it true your sister Lily is suing you for financial hardship?" This was my moment for final clarity, and I didn't flinch. The Jackson Trust fully and transparently honors my grandmother's true and legal will. The claims of unjust eviction are unfortunate, desperate attempts to conceal a documented history of probate fraud and identity falsification by those involved. I looked directly into the camera, ensuring the truth was undeniable. I then directly addressed Lily's frivolous move. Regarding the baseless lawsuit, the trust resolved it by immediately purchasing the property in question from the bank at fair market value, ensuring the debt was paid in full. I paused for effect, letting the lawyer's cold efficiency sink in. That property, the one my sister and her husband failed to maintain, will now be converted into affordable housing units for the local community, under the foundation's explicit mandate. A visible ripple of shock and frantic scribbling went through the press corps. This was my subtle, final, and publicly ethical sting, turning their last gasp of entitlement into a headline about equity. Mark, Lily, Robert, and Sarah watching the announcement on a small, cheap TV in their cramped, temporary rental apartment. Their faces were masks of pure, impotent rage and utter disbelief. They were finally defeated on every imaginable level, legal, financial, and, most satisfyingly, moral. The thing they cherished most, their social facade, was irrevocably shattered. I delivered my final statement, refocusing the narrative completely. My focus is not on the toxic past. It is entirely on the future. I am dedicating these substantial resources to ensure no one else has to sacrifice their purpose or identity for the sake of an emotional illusion or financial gain. The applause was genuine and strong. I had stood up for myself, not with anger but with unshakable, powerful truth. The chapter was closed. My world finally found peace and purpose, but the Jacksons' world was rapidly descending into self-inflicted chaos. They were confined to a cramped, 3-bedroom rental in a forgettable suburb, instantly stripped of their social shields, their private clubs, and their network of sycophants. The Jacksons weren't just poor, they were visibly poor, which to them was far worse than financial ruin. Their misery was no longer contained within the walls of their mansion, it was out in the open, ripe for dissection. The immediate reaction was predictable. Robert and Sarah, masters of deflection, immediately turned their full, poisonous focus onto each other. The veneer of their 20-year marriage evaporated within 48 hours of the eviction. Robert snarled, his voice tight and desperate. "If you hadn't insisted on that ridiculous disclaimer meeting, we could have salvaged the situation. Your greed, Sarah, your absolute refusal to be subtle, ruined us." Sarah shrieked back, her face mottled with mascara and pure, impotent rage. "Don't you dare blame me, Robert. You married the wrong sister. If you'd just let me handle the trust years ago, we wouldn't be paying for your pathetic affair with Jennifer's money. You were weak then, and you're weak now." The raw, ugly truth of their foundationless relationship was finally exposed. Mark and Lily, witnessing the total, brutal breakdown of their parents and their entire privileged worldview, added their own desperate poison to the mix. Lily, crying hysterically, lashed out at Mark. "Your failed luxury car business is why we have absolutely nothing. You promised me we'd never be poor. Now we can't even afford a decent nanny. We're ruined because of your mistakes, Mark." Mark, equally defeated, finally turned on his father. "We relied on you. You taught us this. You told us the Jackson name was unbreakable. You relied on Eleanor's wealth, just like we relied on yours. We are all failures here, and it started with you, Father." Robert looked at his children, utterly defeated, the final realization dawning that his family was built not on love, but on shared financial entitlement. He simply sat down on their cheap, rented sofa, a hollow shell of the man who had once dominated a boardroom. My role, thanks to the immense, necessary distance I had created, was simple: to be the observer of their entirely self-inflicted destruction. The Jacksons didn't need my active revenge anymore. They were systematically destroying each other perfectly well on their own, gnawing through the last threads of their collective illusion. My emotional energy, once focused on them, was now reserved for the Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation. The final nails were hammered into their coffin by the legal system. Catherine informed me of the final, humiliating legal blow. The criminal investigation into the initial probate fraud not only confirmed Robert's actions but revealed that he had illegally shielded substantial assets in Sarah's name overseas in an attempt to hide them from the trust. They now both face separate and severe criminal charges for fraud and tax evasion. "Their life of privilege is over, Danielle," Catherine stated, her voice conveying the finality of the law. "They will lose whatever tiny social status they had left, and both Robert and Sarah are likely facing significant jail time." I simply replied, looking at the city skyline from my new office, "Good. Let the legal system handle them now. My work is done. My job was to bring the truth to light, not to be their judge, jury, and executioner. The law will do the rest." The last shadow of pain I felt wasn't that I lost a family, but the cold, clear realization that the family I thought I had was never real to begin with. The Jackson house, the money, the very name they clung to, it was all an expensive, fragile lie built on my mother's death and my grandmother's grief. I allowed myself a moment of quiet sadness for the child who had once believed in that lie. My future, however, was no longer defined by their failure, but by my mother's profound legacy. I was building a life, not on inherited guilt or borrowed wealth, but on earned purpose and authentic creation. The foundation, now operating, was the solid, tangible proof of my new reality. I finally felt the genuine, unburdened weight of my own life settle comfortably upon me. I smiled a real, full smile. Revenge had been the necessary vehicle, but justice and self-possession were the ultimate destination. And I had finally arrived, entirely free. The days in my new life were busy, filled with demanding proposals, crucial zoning meetings, and the complex logistics of building a legacy. My focus was absolute. My digital world reflected this change. My inbox was no longer jammed with the desperate, toxic threats from the Jacksons or their lawyers, but with messages of thanks, genuine support, and professional collaboration. These were the new connections I had earned, built on trust and shared purpose, not coercion or inherited status. One morning, one particular email caught my eye. It was from an old college professor, Dr. Eleanor Ramos, someone who hadn't contacted me in years. She'd clearly followed the news of the trust battle and remembered the quiet, intense focus of the student who had struggled to be seen. Her subject line read simply, but profoundly, "Justice is a blueprint, too." I opened the message and her words brought tears to my eyes, tears of genuine emotional relief, not pain. Dr. Ramos wrote, "I always knew you possessed the same extraordinary vision and ethical drive as Jennifer. You've navigated a brutal, public trial with grace and strategic brilliance. You have proven that the truest inheritance isn't passive money, it's the moral fiber to use that power for collective good. You finally validated yourself, Danielle. Your mother would be incredibly proud." Her words, untainted by the Jackson name, solidified my path forward. Later that day, a handwritten letter arrived, addressed simply to the foundation on the envelope. It was from a family, a single mother and her 2 children who would be the first beneficiaries of the affordable housing project, which was Lily's old house. They didn't know the full story, only that a foundation had paid off the debt and was turning the property into secure, fair housing. Their simple, direct words resonated deeper than any $1,000,000 check. "You changed our lives. Thank you for giving us hope." That moment redefined the entire revenge saga for me. I realized the power shift wasn't merely the legal transfer of wealth, it was the acquisition of moral authority. I had the resources to instantly silence the Jacksons, but far more importantly, I had the genuine integrity to earn the unwavering respect of the community, the people who truly mattered. I looked out over the city, the canvas of my mother's dream. There was no lingering regret for the revenge. It had been the necessary fire to burn away the toxic history, the lie, and the pain. What remained was a perfectly clean slate, ready for Jennifer's blueprint. My life was finally built on solid ground. I had exchanged a fragile, toxic inheritance for a permanent, ethical legacy of hope. The deafening media circus eventually faded. The toxic Jackson name, once synonymous with elite power, became a grim footnote in local crime reports, a cautionary tale of hubris and financial fraud. My life was now beautifully, entirely defined by the purposeful sounds of the construction sites and the invigorating smell of fresh blueprints. My focus was absolute, clear, and unyielding, creation over confrontation. I wasn't fighting the past, I was designing the future. The Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation's inaugural project, the affordable housing complex, finally broke ground on the repurposed land. This wasn't just another real estate development, it was the tangible, physical manifestation of my mother's long-stolen vision of equity and community-centric planning. I often visited the site, standing amidst the foundation work, wearing a hard hat and protective vest. I touched Jennifer's simple platinum ring, which I wore every day. It was a tangible reminder that I was here not by the Jacksons' fleeting approval, but by blood and destiny, a direct and unbreakable commitment to the truth. The ring wasn't a symbol of power. It was a symbol of my moral accountability to Jennifer's principles. Catherine called with the very last news regarding the architects of my suffering. Robert, in a final, surprisingly paternal act, or perhaps a self-serving attempt to avoid shared isolation, pleaded guilty to the majority of the financial crimes to lessen Sarah's eventual prison sentence. They were finally, irrevocably, and permanently separated by prison bars, a fitting, cold conclusion to a marriage built on ambition and deceit. Their legal sentence sealed their fate, eliminating any possibility of a future reunion or restoration of status. As for Lily and Mark, the spoiled bystanders, they simply vanished from the public eye. They lost their home, which I noted with cold satisfaction, was now a crucial foundation asset, and were forced to find honest, daily wage work to survive. Their self-inflicted downfall was complete. I felt no lingering pity for them. Their complicity over the years had stripped them of that right. I only felt the pure intellectual satisfaction that justice, unclouded by emotion and driven by cold, logical consequences, had ultimately prevailed. They became the ghost of the life I narrowly escaped. One quiet evening, I sat alone in my new, modest, and intentionally nondescript condo, not a lavish mansion, but a home I had entirely earned, bought with my own honest income. I looked out at the vast, glittering expanse of the city below. I no longer saw the suffocating shadows of the past, but the boundless potential of the future, the spaces where my mother's legacy, and now mine, would take root. I realized that the revenge plot had been the necessary engine. It gave me the visceral fire and the strategic focus required to break free from my captors. But the true, invaluable gift I received was the courage to live authentically without their perpetual, damaging permission, and the strength to define my own personal value based entirely on my constructive actions, not their destructive abuse. I had spent years obsessed with meticulously taking back what was rightfully mine. But the final, profound realization was that I didn't just take back a financial fortune. I took back my identity, my history, and my very soul. I was no longer the abused daughter or the vengeful heir. I was Danielle Lee, the founder, the planner, the survivor. My life was now rooted in sustained hope. The whole terrible, transformative chapter was over. I was finally profoundly at peace. My new world was clean, professional, and exhilarating. It revolved around events that truly mattered: foundation galas, specialized city planning dinners, and meetings with philanthropists who shared Jennifer's vision. I was here on undeniable merit, not on the toxic currency of the Jackson name. I belonged, completely and authentically, in this new arena defined by competence and ethical action. That night, at a high-profile city planning reception, the ghost of the past made one last, tentative appearance. A man approached me, Eric, a childhood acquaintance of Lily's, the kind of person who existed solely within the now shattered Jackson social orbit. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, clearly having heard the full, ugly story of the Jacksons' downfall. Eric's eyes, however, betrayed the social judgment I was accustomed to from that old world. He adopted a tone of false, condescending sympathy. "Danielle, I heard about your family. It's truly terrible. Lily and Mark are completely ruined. They lost everything. It must be so hard for you, seeing them fall like that, being the one who initiated it all." The subtle implication was that I was the villain, not them. I met his gaze evenly, my own expression calm, professional, and utterly unshaken. I was no longer the girl who shrank from confrontation. "Eric," I replied, using his name to establish my control. "The Jackson family chose their fate through years of meticulously documented financial fraud and ethical neglect. My focus, now and permanently, is on the Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation and its work in urban equity." I intentionally used the full, purposeful name, a clear signal that the conversation about their domestic drama was over. He pressed further, trying to drag me back into the emotional mud of their narrative. He took a nervous sip of his drink and leaned in, attempting to force me back into my old role of emotional subject. "But don't you feel guilty? They're still family. You took everything they had. Don't you regret the revenge? Doesn't that weigh on you?" His question, once potentially devastating, felt hollow, a relic from a world I no longer inhabited. My voice was low, yet absolutely firm, carrying the weight of my hard-won peace. "I found justice, Eric, and genuine justice is rarely a simple, fleeting emotion like guilt or regret. It's a profound state of balance. I am balanced now." I deliberately placed my empty glass on a passing waiter's tray, signaling that the dialogue had reached its organic end. I offered him a small, polite, and genuine smile, the kind that clearly conveyed finality, not warmth or invitation. "Now, if you'll excuse me," I said, my tone impeccably professional, "I have a meeting scheduled regarding our next urban renewal project with the mayor's office. My constructive work continues." I turned and walked away. The camera held on Eric. He stood frozen, glass in hand, realizing with a visible shudder that the Jackson drama he and his circle had gossiped about was utterly dead. Danielle hadn't just defeated the Jacksons, she had transcended their petty world, trading their toxic history for a powerful, ethical future. The camera then followed me as I walked through the crowded reception hall. I was no longer the nervous outsider or the vengeful daughter, but a powerful, purposeful woman with a clear moral purpose, self-determined future. There were no longer any old ties to cool, they had been cleanly severed. My final act of freedom was not the revenge itself, but the ability to walk away from it entirely. I was, at last, truly, absolutely free to build. My biggest public platform was no longer the toxic stage of a courtroom or the pages of a scandal sheet. It was the brightly lit, purposeful setting of a national television studio. I was giving a crucial, high-profile interview, not about my family's scandalous downfall, but about the innovative work and expansive goals of the Jennifer Jackson Legacy Foundation. It was the ultimate, satisfying pivot from defensive victimhood to proactive influence. The interviewer, a sharp woman who clearly understood the dramatic arc of my story, steered the conversation away from zoning laws and towards my personal journey. She asked the inevitable, final, deeply philosophical question, "Ms. Lee, after experiencing such a protracted, traumatic, and public past, what did you ultimately learn about the nature of family?" I met her gaze fully composed, entirely genuine. I didn't hesitate. I learned that blood is only a color. True family isn't inherited through genetics, it is forged and built on mutual respect, conscious choice, and a shared ethical purpose. I built my real, supportive family here within the framework of this foundation and my professional community. I gestured subtly toward the foundation's logo displayed prominently in the background. My voice was calm, but carried the undeniable weight of wisdom gained from years of struggle. I continued, turning the spotlight back onto the source of my strength. The Jacksons, through their calculated abuse and legal maneuvering, forced me to become a dedicated and ruthless legal tactician. They intended to break me. Instead, they only gave me the precise tools to fight, and I chose to use those tools not for their destruction, but for ethical creation. That choice, the choice to build rather than burn, is what ultimately defined my new, self-determined life. I didn't shy away from the revenge itself, but framed it as a necessary catalyst. The deep, initial rage was, admittedly, the powerful engine that drove the initial legal battle. But I want to be clear, the ultimate destination was never their complete downfall. The true, crucial destination was my own lasting freedom, the reclaiming of my identity, and the permanent realization of Jennifer's ethical vision for this city. I was careful to ensure that the narrative ended with me, on my terms. I concluded the interview with a powerful, forward-looking statement, a final, public declaration of my personal renewal. My story ends not with the morbid spectacle of a family falling apart, but with a new life, finally and decisively turning towards the light. The Jackson name is nothing but a toxic shadow that I have deliberately and permanently left behind. Danielle Lee is now the name of a founder, a planner, and a woman who builds. You've seen the Jackson family fall. You've followed the legal war, the corporate maneuvers, and the final, quiet implosion of their superficial empire. But what's the real, ultimate takeaway from a dramatic story like mine? It's incredibly simple, yet easily forgotten. Revenge is never the end goal. Revenge is entirely emotional. It demands a psychological payment in kind, which only leaves you empty. Justice is logical and restorative. It demands the permanent restoration of balance and the establishment of objective truth. I chose justice. I used their own system, their own rules, and their own cold logic to dismantle their decade-spanning lies, not just their lives. The result was a clean, surgical break. The true, deep victory wasn't the millions of dollars I inherited. It was the precise moment I realized my inherent self-worth wasn't tied to the Jackson name or their conditional approval. That foundational realization is the one thing they could never steal. and it is absolutely indestructible. And here's my final warning, my piece of hard-won advice to anyone watching who comes from a toxic, manipulative family. Remember this above all else: the moment you consciously define your purpose and your value outside their destructive narrative, you become completely unstoppable. They instantly lose all power, all leverage, and all control over you. My mother, Jennifer, wanted a legacy of ethical planning and community equity. I fought a brutal war to secure that vision. Now, as I step fully into my future, I ask you, the viewer, the person who witnessed this journey, what legacy are you fighting for? Is it for the toxic past you are struggling to escape, or is it for the powerful, authentic future you are actively building? The choice is entirely yours. My legal and personal journey is finally over, but for many of you watching, yours might be just beginning. If you're currently facing your own Jackson family, whether it's toxic relatives, deceptive partners, or unfair systems, remember these 5 essential lessons I learned the hard way. They are the true foundation of my lasting freedom. First, Lesson 1: documentation is destiny. Never rely on trust when dealing with manipulation. Always have irrefutable legal proof and paper trails. Second, Lesson 2: emotional distance is protection. You can't strategically fight a fire if you're standing in the flames. Create legal and emotional boundaries to protect your mind. Third, Lesson 3: the true here is the ethical here. Inherited money or status is useless without a moral purpose. Define the good you intend to do. Fourth, Lesson 4: define your own success. Never let the Jacksons or anyone toxic's conditional approval be your finish line. Your value is self-determined. And finally, the most important realization, Lesson 5, justice is found in creation. Use the pain and the rage as fuel, not as chains. Stop obsessing over the past and the people who hurt you. Start building your authentic future now. Did any of these lessons resonate with your own experience? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you want to see more stories of victims turned founders and how we can all reclaim our narratives. Until next time, keep building.